Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this timely and impactful panel discussion. Today, we're focusing on the most recent negotiated rulemaking at the Department of Education. This moment of political transition provides a chance to revisit recent regulatory outcomes and identify ways to improve the future of higher education regulation. We're privileged to have three remarkable panelists with us today. Phil Hill is a renowned education technology expert and author of a widely read EdTech newsletter. Phil has an exceptional talent for breaking down complex issues and offering actionable insights on how technology intersects with policy in higher education. Scott Pulsipher, president of Western Governors University, is a trailblazer in student-centered education. His leadership has exemplified how to deliver high-quality education at scale while keeping affordability and accessibility front and center. Mark Millar, president of National University, has positioned the institution as a leader in delivering for working learners. His experience and vision are transforming the landscape to better serve the diverse needs of today's students. Here's how this conversation will work. We'll cover four key questions, each panelist providing a concise 90-second response. After each question, we'll have a 3-minute moderated conversation to explore the topic further, and the entire session will conclude in about 30 minutes, keeping the discussion focused and engaging, which is a tall order when our topic is negotiated rulemaking. With that, let's dive into our first question. Question 1. What's your takeaway on the way that the program integrity and institutional quality negotiated rulemaking concluded with only 3 of the 6 subject areas moving to finalization and some of the most controversial issues being left out of the final rules altogether? Phil, we'll start with you.
I guess in one word, it's whiplash. We've gone through 2.5 or even more years of regulatory actions where the approach from the Department of Education was consistent. And they had their point of view. They wanted to go after consumer protection. And the approach to listening to people in the community was that if you push back, then you were trying to avoid regulation or you had bad intentions, if you will. And that changed in December with the way that rulemaking concluded, because not only did they pull out 3 of the actions, and the biggest one that I was looking at was attendance taking for all online courses. But what was really significant for me was the Department of Education in their document saying, hey, we were persuaded by comments. This is going to cause a lot of harm. We need to study, take our time, get it right. And that's unprecedented for this administration. So that's what really struck out to me, not just that what they pushed through, but why they made the decisions they did. And it was very encouraging to see that they're listening. Now, the whiplash part is action subsequent to that indicated that might have been a one-time blip for this administration, but it was a welcome change.
Right. Okay, Mark, we're coming your way.
Yeah, I think Phil's spot on in the whiplash part of it, because a lot of people had to immediately kind of get our arms around what they were going for and why they were going for it. And what I will say as a matter of grace, I think there were a lot of people who were trying to do good things for people, for students in particular. They had their hearts in the right place in terms of trying to make sure consumer protection was taken care of. There were a lot of people who were exploited in the past. And so I think with the best of intentions, unfortunately, they rolled out a family of regulations and strategies that actually had the unintended consequences. In fact, just had a family of unintended consequences that if they had taken a beat and engaged higher ed in a conversation earlier, they probably could have shaped better, more enabling policy. And I think what I hope we've learned out of this process, and what I think, as being a part of the President's Forum, we actually said this out loud to them. It's like, take the time to talk to us ahead of time, and we can help you run the traps on this before you propose it. And I'm hoping down the road we can actually get to a place where this kind of thing they don't get out over their skis and have to roll back things as hard as they've had to roll back things. And so I think I'm hoping we can get some lessons out of this. I know it's probably Pollyanna-ish in some ways, but I do think it was time after time that was happening, and I think we've probably learned that lesson. Let's work together on this.
Good thoughts there, Mark. Scott, we're going to come your way on your perspective on how this last negotiated rulemaking ended up.
I'll just comment on two things. One is the process. I think somewhat I just want to weigh in like Phil and Mark did, but particularly Phil, you reported quite a bit on this, is that the process already was so skewed to begin with. Like we knew that some of the where the indications were that the rules were potentially going to go were not going to reflect actually the sector as a whole. And I think Mark is spot on in highlighting the fact that says it's not enough to have those who think and analyze and kind of consider policy. It's not enough to just have that perspective represented. You also have to have operators represented. You need to have the institutions at the table. You need to have those who understand how to implement these different rules, et cetera. And that only came about when they got all the comments. And as Phil noted, it's like the comments, I think, finally, thankfully, were actually quite persuasive. But we did have some good wins in this. Like I would say that, we know that particularly for an institution like WGU, where we largely serve our students through online experiences, like while regulations are supposed to be well-intentioned, we'd be better served by approaching it from a standpoint of outcomes or value for the students, especially if they're supposed to be the primary beneficiary. And so that matters more than modality. The other thing maybe to highlight is maybe gives some kind of signal that they're mitigating the effects of Congressional Review Act. It may give future Democratic administrations the ability to propose rules that would have been unwound completely by a CRA action.
Right. That's a great point. Okay, so we have a few minutes here to talk through this based on everybody's responses. Let me remind Phil might not know this, but Scott and Mark, you'll recall that we, as the President's Forum, we wrote a letter to James Cavall urging him to have the President's Forum in the negotiated rulemaking process as a stakeholder, somebody from the President's Forum to do, like we've talked about, to provide more insight, earlier insight as well, and to represent working learners. But one of the key takeaways I heard the three of you talk about is it seems like we heard from the department that they actually took the responses and the comments into consideration. Why do you think that happened at the end, but not during or at the beginning? What changed for the department?
Well, I got it wrong. So let me start out with that. I wrote a blog post where I said, oh, wow, they realize they're going down a bad path and they're listening to activist groups way too much, and they've learned their lesson. But with subsequent actions, I don't think that explains it. I think that it was significant and welcome, but that doesn't explain it. So why did they do it? Clearly, there was political maneuvering on what they could push over the finish line by the end of the administration. It was very calculated, much more Machiavellian than what I gave them credit for in my post. But I'm admitting that I got it wrong. So there's some guesswork here.
Scott, Mark, what do you think?
I would, it's hard to say. I would certainly think that the institutional leaders and a variety of those who actually have, their pulse, if you will, or at least they're closer to where the rubber meets the road versus analysts who are doing policy work and stuff like that. They're like, absent that perspective, I do think it has been persuasive. But Phil, to your references, the kind of guidance that's been given outside of negotiated rulemaking seems like they basically just said, well, we're going to mess with you anyway, even if the incoming administration will just unwind some of that, guidance, because that guidance becomes regulation by which institutions and students and everyone else now has to operate. Some of that guidance goes into effect immediately, unlike rules. And so it's still a political world. Like, we get it. And the politics of it are certainly shaped by who wins elections and who's leading Congress, et cetera. It will be interesting to even see how kind of the post-Chevron world or the post-Chevron deference world what that actually also does portend for legal challenges to this. We've seen successful legal challenges for the income-driven repayment, changes they wanted to make with respect to Title IX. We saw that effect. Like, who knows what else may also have some activism around it.
Mark, I know we're running short here. We're going over on this one. Tell us any epiphanies on the change from the department. What caused it?
No, I think what it comes down to is what they thought they could get done, right? And I think there were some things they wanted to get done, and they were trying to optimize the moment that they had in it. I do think they took feedback. They tried to figure out what made the most sense for what they could get done given their priorities. And I don't want to ascribe motives. I mean, I think a lot of times they absolutely were trying to do what they thought was the right thing for a lot of folks. The problem is, I think their mental model of higher education is structured in a model of higher education from the past in particular, and not understanding the dynamic nature of kind of modern students and the variety of higher education players that are out there, and the conflating in particular of for-profits with innovative models was in particularly problematic. Right. And I think that just bled over into a whole bunch of things, and we were fighting that battle the entire time.
Right. Okay, question number 2. Scott, we're coming your way first, and then Phil,
okay,
and then Mark. Question 2. How should distance and online learning be regulated moving forward?
Well, I think I'll start where Mark ended, which is that we need to recognize that the modern enrollment or the modern student is like very different than what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, even, to where in some ways online was the political boogeyman, if you will, that it was all fleecing students and not actually advancing value or quality or access in higher education. But we know that if one thing is true, as Phil, you've reported on a lot with respect to NCES data, National Student Clearinghouse data, that says the majority of students today are either exclusively online or taking some online. It's like the digital world of learning is actually here to stay, and it's certainly increased. And so we need to advance the whole regulatory framework to consider that it's not about modality. It's still really about reimagining a system that increases the value, the relevancy of education, that ensures that institutions are taking a higher degree of accountability for helping students not only enroll, but persist and complete, and that having completed actually leads to value for them. Maybe I'll just take a moment to reference the fact that, some time ago, I actually testified to the House Committee on Education and the Workforce about this, that we should, institutions, meaning any provider of a pathway to opportunity, should be held accountable for 3 simple outcomes: improving completion rates, meaning that students who start should complete, otherwise the value is missed; return on that investment they made, is it relevant to the opportunity; and lastly, does it work for everyone? We simply see that as equity in both access and attainment.
Great. And we'll try to find the video of the testimony and link that to this post when we put it up, Scott.
I certainly was dressed a lot better in it than currently. I had a tie on and everything. It looked very official.
It makes the words sound more accurate for some reason.
If only I could mock that British accent.
Phil, tell us, how should distance and online learning be regulated moving forward?
Well, one thing and we're sort of talking around this, but I just want to hit it a little bit harder. The modern learner is different. And we have a situation of, the whole traditional, non-traditional language is broken down. Basically, we have a lot more working adults, but we also have a lot more lifelong learning, and people are in different situations. And that has to be factored into it should be factored into all regulatory approaches, so that we're helping those learners, not misunderstanding them and creating unintended consequences. Now, I do have to admit, I'm a little bit disappointed in this panel that we're agreeing with each other so much. But the other thing I'll go back to with our violent agreement is the fact of process. This is a complicated industry of education with all kinds of nuance. And that feedback loop that we talked about in the first question is just so important. So we need to have efficient rulemaking, but it's got to be centered on letting operators and people who are in the trenches and know what this means to impact institutions, faculty, students, borrowers, et cetera. Here's how it's actually going to work, and have a legitimate process to get their input so that we get future regulations right. So demographics and process, I think, are the biggest ones for me.
Yeah, great call out, Phil. Mark, the future of distance and online learning, how should it be regulated?
To me, I think it has to do with how education should be regulated. I loved Scott's framework, and I think the idea of us holding us all accountable to make sure students are learning well, finishing strong, launching effectively into their careers, and improving our economies, improving our world. I think that's how education itself should be kind of brought. And part of what we need to think about is make sure that we're launching at National University something we call our Ander campaign, and the Ander campaign is like our students are all Anders. They are deployed military and students. They are working and students. They are parents and students. Anders are more complicated, and you have to actually have different kinds of models. National didn't begin as an online university. National began in 1972. That we were using cutting edge technology like tape recorders. I mean, we invented short courses because it lowered cognitive load for working students and for deployed students, and so they could take 4 or 5 week one course at a time, and it worked for them. We'll use whatever technology, technique, policy, practice that'll help this population of learners learn well and finish strong. What we need is a regulatory framework that will allow people who are serving that population to do it well. And by the way, there are a lot of people who want to focus on 18-year-olds right from high school. God bless them. There's a whole bunch of those folks. They need to do that well. All of us should be held to the same standard. Is what we're doing helping our students learn well, finish strong, and launch effectively?
How, now this is just to get this conversation started on this question. Has distance and online learning regulation been tied up with for-profits, and how has that impacted the regulation? How do we get away from that if that's the case?
Well, I mean, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Phil. You take it.
It definitely has been tied up with that, particularly in this administration. I think we had one bright spot in the end of the Trump administration where that didn't happen. And that was with regular and substantive interaction. And that was a case where when we actually formed a subcommittee and really looked at the details, regardless of sector ownership or whatever, and how do you make this an effective rulemaking? But outside of that example, yes, it has been tied up way too much with for-profits. And I think the whole focus on modality and ownership have tripped us up, and it's more outcomes, as we've been talking about.
Shift to outcomes. Scott, coming your way.
Pivot off of that last point too, is that there's a lot of ironies. I think, myself, even though I'm coming up on 9 years at WGU, I still feel like I'm new to the sector because of the things that seem like ironies to me. An irony to me around something like regular and substantive is that they wanted attendance taking in an online world, but they don't even have attendance taking in an in-person world. And so you're kind of like, we just presume that somehow all these things occur if you're in person, but that we have to track it in this other modality. And I think the reason that got conflated with for profit, if you will, is because the outcomes were so poor. Students weren't completing, and it was costing them a lot of money, and there was a lot of federal student aid going to it, et cetera. Now, it doesn't mean that all of them were poor. It just means that it actually, in comparison to a conventional model, they were definitely worse. We've certainly even seen that in recent reporting. However, we certainly know that it's dramatically increased flexibility for the individuals that we've talked about, these modern learners. We certainly know that there's ways to design an immersive student-centered experience in online, but that doesn't mean that with all of that innovation that we somehow should be absolved of delivering on the outcomes that ultimately matter. And it's nice to see that while more and more publics and nonprofits are going online, there's more and more reporting on the outcomes. And we may see that even in those that have a favorable non-taxable status may in fact come under scrutiny of regulatory oversight, because if you don't have outcomes, then we don't want to keep funding your process model.
Right. Mark, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, one of the hardest parts in this whole thing is the bad actors. And by the way, there are bad actors in nonprofit and in for-profit education. There are people exploiting students and the really kind of horrible thing about this where this caused problems is the bad actors not only used kind of cutting edge technology that they could scale quickly, they went after the most vulnerable populations. And so you ended up with a correlation causation problem because those students often have a harder time learning well, finishing strong, and launching effectively because of all kinds of life events and all kinds of other things that are going on. So people assumed it was the modality that caused the problems, right? So again, I go back to Scott's kind of idea about looking at the outcomes. I think if you looked what was happening, they weren't learning well, they weren't finishing strong, they weren't launching effectively. The signal should have been caught sooner, and the bad acting should have stopped. And it wasn't about the modality; it was about what they were doing and how they were doing it.
Right. Right. Okay. We're going to transition now to specifically negotiated rulemaking as a process. So, Mark, we'll come your way first with this question. How would you like to see the process utilized moving forward?
I think there has to be much more of a dialogue, and Scott said it best, with the operators. I think it's got to be, because the field of higher education is so diverse, we've got to make sure that we engage first with a conversation with the folks who are operating in some ways to kind of get their ideas about what needs to happen more in a more pronounced way, in a more direct way, and then maybe even begin with the exchange earlier around what the challenges might be. What really concerned me is like the unintended consequences were caught early by the comments, and the challenge we ended up being in this kind of cycle of recrimination as opposed to actually trying to craft good policy. I do think, overall, I'm going to be very interested to see how this goes forward post Chevron, because I think what's going to happen now is we actually are going to have to get back to the reauthorization of higher education cycle, which is probably a better cycle, because in that kind of policy crafting, people do the legwork before they get into this. Because right now it ends up being, kind of arguing based on a rule base that's 20 years old. Like it feels like, we're going to hopefully get back to policy making again. And again, it might be Pollyanna, but I think it's going to be a lot better if we can do it that way.
Like it. I would love to see that happen. We are going to Scott now. Scott, what do you think? What would you like to see happen with negotiated rulemaking moving forward?
Yeah, this this is just I think a thought that just popped into my head as I was thinking about this, is that as I jokingly say that I'm a terrible lobbyist doing this for nearly 9 years. Is like I haven't seen anything really advance on the legislative front, and I'm actually wondering whether you can pursue regulatory agenda to actually as a prompt for the Congress to do its job to advance law that's desperately needed in spaces like, something, Phil, you referenced, like, hey, individuals are learning over a whole life. It's not a one and done model. It's a rinse and repeat model. I'm going to do it one time and the next time and the next time, et cetera. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the multimodal models that we have out there today that exist? How do we deal with working learners? How do we reinvent time? Because not everyone should be in a full-time kind of consideration, but you wouldn't want to exclude them from federal aid. And I do wonder whether if the negotiated rulemaking takes up some of the most important things, that they basically push the boundaries of what current statute actually allows, and it forces statutory. A simple example to me would be like grad plus loans. When there's so many bad outcomes in terms of, from an economic standpoint around graduate programs today, and yet the statute just allows unfettered access to loans. And are there ways to actually start regulating those things in a way that says we don't let this runaway train keep happening if it's only a prompt for Congress to do its job? But with all that being said, you got to have the constituents at the table that are operating.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, though, Scott. That could be using it strategically to make some things happen. That's very, very interesting. Phil, what do you think? How would you like to see the process utilized moving forward?
Well, I guess I'm not quite ready to go into fantasy land and think that Congress is going to do their job. So let's focus on the question here. I'm trying to get some disputes going. If I had to say what I would change, first of all, it would be who makes up the negotiated rulemaking. And you don't want to have the Department of Education stacking the deck, picking people. This administration, or the Biden administration, did mostly. Arnold Ventures coalition that I've written about, ideologues who knew the outcome they wanted from the beginning. And then they did not choose a lot of people who could have given the operator viewpoint. So we got to change who gets into negotiated rulemaking. And it's sort of ironic, since we're talking online education, I would make the NEGREG in person again. Where things can work out is where you might actually be able to do hallway conversations in between sessions and treat people like humans and discuss, maybe even do some coalition making in the dark hallway that you can bring back and push things along in NEGREG. So if I had two specific things, I would do that, is somehow change the process of who gets nominated, and then I would make it in person again. Back to work, people.
Right. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Okay, so in this conversation, you both, all three of you have mentioned we've got to get the right people involved, and we specifically we've talked about operators being involved. If you could go back, what types of people would you have liked to have seen included in this last rulemaking that weren't included? What kind of operators?
Certainly, I would say that you'd want a good example would be simply someone who's trying to design and develop a blended hybrid model that includes academic and work-based learning. If you want to think about different modes, you'd want to have someone who's president or at least an academic leader of an predominantly online institution. You'd certainly want to have financial aid administrators at that table because they know all the rules that are how they're being implemented at an individual student level. And you're trying to actually have those that say, hey, here's the patterns that we can identify that when you take it from one student to millions of students, that might be better practice that can be represented in a regulatory policy. That's the type of thing that I would like to see. Now, that's not to say you don't do that in lieu of analysts. You need the policy analysts there too, because they are also thinking about the direction that they're wanting to take things, et cetera. But I would say, we don't have enough of those who are saying when you try to develop a policy going after one particular thing, when applied at scale, what would that actually look like and how cumbersome would it be? What data is actually required, et cetera. Not enough of that is being discussed when considering implementation of rules.
Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think having the variety of institutional types really matters because there are distinctions between community colleges, private liberal arts colleges, big online players like WGU and others. Like I think we have to have variety of institutional types, not to mention the variety of the roles, everything from financial aid to the academic operators. I do think, and I'd love to get Phil's take on this, I think we have to get some people involved in the process who actually understand the true regulatory burden of all this, because what's happened is by doing the way we've been doing it, we've been actually continually adding, and the total regulatory burden is getting to the place where it is getting a bit ridiculous, where it's really hard to be a good actor and try to actually serve your students incredibly well. And I think at some point that voice has got to get into the room and say, hey, is there a way we can make this more elegant and achieve these three goals with one thing as opposed to doing three different things to try to get at the exact same goal? Like, and there's not enough of that conversation in the room because people just aren't thinking about how do you take a small HBCU and throw this regulatory burden at them and expect them to be able to survive? They can't because of just their administrative capacity. If you're a big player, if you're a Southern New Hampshire or a WGU, you've got staff galore to be able to take care of that. If you're a small community college, you don't have that. And I don't think that's in there at all. Right.
Phil, we're going to go over on this one, but give us your perspective on this.
Well, one thing I definitely think we need people who have a variety of experiences and clearly operators from different goals, but also people who I've seen it from this side of the angle and I've seen it here and here's how to interpret it. And maybe part of what we want to do is get more into picking subcommittees where the subcommittees can go down and do this type of working out the issues ahead of time so that the main committee can do the negotiated rulemaking. And I do realize there's a risk of adding to the process, but I think we need it.
Yeah, but if we can bring great minds to solve the right problems, that's worth it. Okay, We're going to go to our last question. We'll wind the clock again to 90 seconds, but the question is, we are 24 hours out from a Biden administration. We're 24 hours into a Trump administration. Many people have already pivoted. And they're looking for ways to work with a new administration. They're saying, what are the opportunities? We know that the only constant in DC is change. So I understand why people are pivoting, but we also know, the worm always turns. And so my question is, what lessons have we learned over the past 4 years that we can apply to the future of higher education regulation? Let's start with Phil.
What have we learned? I mean, we survived this. And if you want to try to find a silver lining, I think there's been a lot of discussion where it's sort of outside the process. We're having valuable conversations on what's needed, what the regulatory burdens are. And it would be great to get some of that knowledge base from the community into the proposed regulations moving forward. I will sort of throw out a caution. It's not quite a direct answer to your question, but one thing we have to be careful about is the area that we agree on. And what we agree on is on accountability, and which I think is a good thing. And how do we schools feel accountable, and not just for profits, not just online modality, but in general. But I would caution us that we're getting pretty deep into this return on investment conversation that's going on, that's attempting to quantify everything about education. And learning cannot be completely quantified. So it's good in terms of let's make sure we're getting good value for investments from the government, from students, whatever. But that's one of the biggest things I'll be looking for is, are we going to take this too far? Because both sides agree on accountability. Let's be careful that we don't then just take it too far and ignore the non-financial benefits of education.
Yeah, interesting point. Mark, we're coming your way on this question. Tell us what we've learned.
Just because I know what Phil just said is going to trigger Scott, I want Scott to go next.
All right, that works. Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I would certainly disagree with that. And simply on this point is like I argued one time with somebody about the public good nature of higher education. I said, it's not a public good in the true economic sense. It is actually certainly has collateral public benefit, but ultimately the benefits accrue to an individual and that individual's family and then the community and then society. We certainly want to see that public benefit. But there's no doubt, I said, one of the biggest and most important things we have to deliver on is the individual's reason for actually pursuing higher education in the first place, so that they can actually live a self-directed life with economic mobility and advancement. We certainly should be holding ourselves accountable to that. I think the presumption even was that when GI Bill and HEA, first was actually passed and federal student aid came into bear, is like that was the assumption that would have that kind of benefit. Now, I'm not ignoring the fact that there is the optionality of post-secondary education. That's hard to value that optionality. We don't have some magic Black-Scholes model for valuing the optionality of getting an education. But optionality is still in self-directed. But all that being said, I would simply come back to, I think, one thing that is true, even in the midst of all that change, is that the student needs to be at the center of what we're advancing in good policy and regulation in higher education. And the other learning for me, especially with the recent neg reg, is partisanship doesn't work. Only bipartisan actually advances good law and good policy.
Good call out, Scott. All right, Mark. Wrap us up on this.
I'm gonna kind of try to bring this together in one framework. Like my core belief is that I'm very Jeffersonian in the idea that if a nation expects to live ignorant and free, it once what never was, what never will be. It is if we want this country to work, you actually want education to work. And there's this, the beautiful thing is our economy has required, over the course of the last 200 years, required more and more and more people from varied backgrounds to get more education than ever before. It is more people from more different backgrounds getting more education than ever because our economy has required it. And I actually think there's a serendipity to that, because now people have had very different opportunities to have different economic trajectories, health trajectories, family trajectories. And we've asked and answered a lot of very hard questions that we're, as a society, having to wrestle with that we didn't wrestle with 100 years ago, right? And that was, I would argue, because the vast majority of people weren't educated. It was much easier to, in some ways, mass control people. I think we as a society are better off when more people are educated. It's harder because you end up in deeper and harder conversations. So we have to develop a system that allows more people to be educated at a high level with solid outcomes. We say it all the time at National. People do not come here to get degrees. They come to National University to change their lives. The degree is a means to that end. The certificate is a degree. The certification is a degree to that end. We want to be a part of that kind of trajectory change. That means we have to do this hard work of figuring out the regulatory framework that allows good players to provide that good service to people who want to take on that work.
Very nice. Okay, so I'm going to start this conversation on this question with a hypothetical, and I'm hoping that you'll indulge me in answering this. Let's imagine that 4 years from now, the Democrat nominee becomes the president. So whoever that is, there's a Democrat that becomes the president. We're talking higher education regulation. What would you hope to accomplish in these 4 years with a Republican that would set the stage for effective policy making in higher education moving forward? To your point, Scott, about it's got to be bipartisan. We can't just have a whiplash from R to D to R to D every 4 years. What do you think? What are the processes, or what would we do right now to make that happen in the future?
If I can go first, I'll just seed it maybe with two things. One, simply that regulation or policy either through regulation or law, that will start to acknowledge the modern learner, as we talked about earlier in our conversation, that modality becomes less of a concern. And so it's actually just recognizing that the state of how individuals pursue post-secondary education, the different modes and methods by which they do it, the different ways in which the workforce is involved, et cetera, that they are just acknowledging that there's a much more comprehensive world that we're working with now. The second thing that I would simply advance is that they see now, given that comprehensiveness, they see the need for greater consistency of applying standards, whether those are outcomes-based, which is what I'd prefer, or whether they're even in process. That there's just certain things that you need to have a level of consistency, because you can't just presume that one is good and presume another is bad. You actually have to have institutions and individuals, because both of those parties are involved here. You have to have some consistency.
Mark, what do you think? What should happen in the next 4 years that would be something that could last beyond that?
Well, I'll play off of what Phil said earlier about we have to figure out what we can, given the environment we have, what can we actually have happen, right? As opposed to just kind of wishing for the kind of grand outcome. I think given the mood of the country, the proclivities of the current administration that is taking hold right now, I think three big things. One, can we get our arms around the regulatory burden and try to bring down the overall regulatory burden in a way that is thoughtful, that does not let bad players in, but actually helps think about the holistic burden we're putting on education and bring that down in some really thoughtful way. Second, expand the vision of who higher education serves. So when we say a college student, everyone doesn't immediately think of a 20-year-old with a backpack over their shoulder on the quad. We actually think about those Anders in a broader way. And I think the third one is I think we have the opportunity with this administration to build much stronger connections between employers and higher education. And I think the idea of building that connection, I don't care if it's with the military and higher education or big business and higher education, small business higher education, like I think the connection, we can build stronger connections because there's interest in that. I think people understand the value of things like tuition assistance and other kinds of connections. I would say we should go after 5250 and try to get that raised. There's a whole family of things we could do with this administration on that, but those are the three big ones I would go after.
Great. Phil, we'll end with you.
I would hope that we would have some positive and negative policy examples. So on the negative front, I hope that most of the policies that were ill-considered and didn't take input from the community get struck down in an embarrassing way. And so that the next Democratic administration will say, all right, if we want to make things happen, we got to do it differently. Mm-hmm. At the same time, maybe there's an area around accountability. If you can bring Phil and Scott together to deal with a return on investment, but bring people together with an effective accountability, and we actually have a policy win where two different sides can say, hey, we both wanted that. We actually won something with it. Yeah. So I would hope that within the next 4 years, we have that really positive example and really negative examples so that the next administration would be incentivized to do things in a way that takes in input.
Right, right. Well, great call out. Thank you to this panel. Thanks for your willingness to share your insights and your perspectives. I'm sure I speak for the entire panel when I say we're looking forward to advancing higher education through accountable innovation and student-centered policy.